The porch light had already been switched off by the time Renee Ashford finished loading the last of her belongings into 2 garbage bags, which told her, more clearly than anything her mother-in-law had said in the past hour, exactly how this night was meant to end. Patricia Ashford stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, unmoved by the cold or by the sight of her late son's widow standing on the front steps with everything she owned. "The house is being sold," Patricia said, for the 3rd time that evening, as though repetition might finally make Renee accept it gracefully. "You were only ever here because Marcus wanted you here, and Marcus is not here anymore." Renee did not argue. She had learned, in the 13 months since her husband's death, that arguing with Patricia only ever bought more cruelty, never less. She carried the bags to the curb, sat down on the cold concrete step because she genuinely did not know where else to go at 9 at night with no car and $40 in her checking account, and pulled out her phone. Buried in her contacts, saved under a name she had never once used, sat the number Gideon Marsh had given every member of his household staff on their first day of employment. "This number is not for scheduling questions or minor complaints," he had told her, in the same flat, serious voice he used for anything that actually mattered. "It is for the night something happens that you cannot manage on your own. I would rather you use it and feel foolish than not use it and regret staying silent." Renee had carried that number for 10 months without once considering using it, certain that whatever hardship she was navigating fell safely under things she could manage herself. Sitting on a curb in the dark with 2 garbage bags and nowhere to sleep, she was no longer certain of that at all. Her thumb hovered over the message field for a long minute before she finally typed 4 words, deliberately vague, unwilling to say the full truth even now. "Locked out. No family." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and then sat in the cold, watching the message deliver, wondering if using the number at all had just been the first real mistake of a very long, humiliating night. Somewhere behind her, she heard the deadbolt turn on the front door, a small, deliberate sound that told her Patricia had no intention of letting her back inside, even to wait for a reply. Renee pulled her coat tighter and stared down the empty street, streetlights flickering on one by one against the deepening dark, and told herself that whatever answer came back, or did not come back, she would still be sitting on this curb in 20 minutes exactly as alone as she was right now. The thought did not comfort her, but it steadied her, the same way bracing for the worst had steadied her through every hard month since Marcus died. She checked her phone screen twice in the next 90 seconds, though she knew perfectly well nothing could have arrived that quickly. A small, useless habit born entirely of how badly she wanted someone, anyone, to answer. Renee had taken the position in Gideon Marsh's household 10 months earlier, 3 months after her husband Marcus's sudden death from a heart condition nobody had known he carried, at a point in her life when she needed steady income considerably more than she needed a job that matched her actual qualifications. She had trained as a nurse before marrying young, a career she had set aside to care for Marcus's aging father during the 2 years before his own death, and had found herself, at 28, widowed and financially dependent on a family that had never fully accepted her, with a nursing license gone stale and bills that did not care about her grief. The Marsh estate had been hiring, the pay considerably better than anything else available to her without recertification, and Marjorie, who ran the household with a brisk warmth Renee had come to rely on, had taken one look at her interview and decided, in the practical way she decided most things, that Renee's steadiness under pressure would translate well to a household that required exactly that. Patricia had never approved of Renee, not during Marcus's life and considerably less after his death, holding a quiet, unspoken belief that her son had married beneath the family's standing and that Renee's continued presence in the family home was a courtesy rather than a right. The house Renee had been staying in, technically still listed under Marcus's name until the estate fully settled, had become the site of an increasingly hostile standoff over the 13 months since his death. Patricia and her surviving son Curtis, pushing steadily toward a sale, neither of them seemed willing to delay for Renee's sake. Renee had absorbed each new pressure quietly, the way she absorbed most things, telling herself the situation would resolve itself before it required anyone else's involvement. She had never once mentioned the growing tension to Gideon or to Marjorie, embarrassed by a family conflict that felt, despite everything, like something she should be capable of managing entirely on her own. Her days at the estate followed a steady rhythm she had come to genuinely value. Mornings spent alongside Marjorie in the kitchen, afternoons managing the household's smaller errands, evenings occasionally crossing paths with Gideon in the hallway or the study, brief exchanges that were courteous without ever being cold. She liked the work more than she had expected to when she first accepted the position out of pure necessity, liked the quiet dignity of a household that ran on competence rather than performance, liked, most of all, that no one here treated her the way Patricia treated her, as a lingering inconvenience left over from a marriage that had technically ended the moment Marcus's heart stopped. She had built, without entirely meaning to, a version of stability inside the Marsh estate that stood in sharp contrast to the instability waiting for her every time she returned to Patricia's house. And some quiet part of her had begun to wonder, though she never let the thought fully form, which of the two places actually felt more like home. The closest Renee had come to telling anyone at the estate about her situation happened one evening in her 4th month, when Gideon found her sitting alone in the estate's kitchen well after her shift had ended, staring at her phone with an expression he clearly recognized as trouble, even though she quickly composed her face when she noticed him. "Everything all right?" he asked, in the economical way he asked most things, direct without being intrusive. "Fine," she said automatically. And then, surprising herself, added, "Family stuff. Nothing important." Gideon studied her for a moment, the particular stillness she had come to associate with him actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Family stuff is rarely nothing," he said, "but I will not push if you would rather not talk about it." Renee appreciated, more than she expected to, that he did not push, and found herself offering more than she had planned to. "My in-laws and I do not agree on much," she admitted. "It has been difficult since Marcus passed." Gideon nodded slowly, absorbing that without the pity she had learned to brace for from people who knew her story. "Grief brings out the worst in some families," he said. "If it ever becomes more than difficult, you know you have options here. That is not charity. That is simply what I offer people who work for me and do their job well, which you do." Renee had thanked him and changed the subject, uncomfortable with how close his offer had come to the actual truth of her situation, though she had thought about the conversation considerably more than she let on in the months that followed. It was, she reflected later, one of the only conversations in 13 months of grief where someone had offered her help without also making her feel smaller for needing it, a small distinction that had mattered more to her than she had been willing to admit at the time. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, noticing small things about Gideon she had not paid attention to before, the way he remembered details other people missed, the way he addressed the household staff by name and asked after their lives without it ever feeling like an obligation, the particular patience he showed toward people who were struggling with something they had not yet found the words for. None of it amounted to anything she would have called an attraction, not yet, but it left an impression, a quiet sense that the man running this household was considerably more attentive than his reputation outside these walls suggested. Marjorie, watching the two of them from a distance with the sharp eyes of someone who had run this household for over a decade, said nothing at the time, though she filed the observation away exactly as carefully as she filed away everything else she noticed and chose not to mention. The estate settlement finalized in Renee's 9th month at the Marsh household, and with it came a letter from Patricia's lawyer that Renee read twice before she fully absorbed what it meant. The house was to be sold within 30 days. Renee, as a resident with no legal claim to the property beyond her late husband's now settled estate, had 30 days to vacate. She had known, abstractly, that this day was coming, but the letter's cold formality still landed harder than she expected, a stark reminder that 13 months of grief had apparently not softened Patricia's determination to remove every trace of her son's marriage from the family's remaining assets. Renee spent the first week after the letter quietly searching for anywhere else to go, an apartment she could afford on her current salary, a distant cousin who might take her in temporarily, options that kept narrowing the longer she looked. She did not mention any of it at the estate, continuing her work with the same careful composure she had maintained for 13 months, though Marjorie, who missed very little in the household she ran, began to notice a tightness in Renee's shoulders that had not been there before. "You are carrying something heavy again," Marjorie observed one afternoon. Not quite a question. I am fine, Renee said, the same automatic deflection she had used for months. Marjorie did not press, though she mentioned it, in passing, to Gideon the following week, framing it only as an observation rather than a concern, uncertain whether it was hers to raise more directly. Gideon filed the comment away without immediate action, respecting, for the moment, whatever boundary Renee had drawn around her personal life. Though he found himself watching her more closely over the following days, noting the same tightness Marjorie had described, waiting to see whether she would eventually bring the trouble. To him herself, he did not raise it directly. Respecting a boundary he sensed Renee had drawn deliberately, though he made small adjustments in the days that followed, arranging his own schedule to be in the kitchen more often in the early evenings, the hours Renee usually finished her work, without ever making the change obvious enough to comment on. Renee noticed anyway, the way people in quiet distress often notice small kindnesses even when they are too proud to acknowledge them out loud, and found herself, without entirely admitting why, lingering a little longer over her evening tasks than the work strictly required. Neither of them named what was happening between them. A slow, cautious kind of attention neither was ready to call by any particular word, but it sat there regardless, steady and unspoken, alongside the trouble Renee still had not found the courage to share. With 8 days remaining before the sale closed and Renee still without anywhere secured to go, Gideon found her in the garden one evening and asked, directly this time, whether the family trouble she had mentioned months earlier had resolved itself. Renee hesitated long enough that the answer became obvious before she spoke a single word. Mostly, she said, which they both understood to be a lie. Gideon did not call her on it directly, though something in his expression made clear he recognized it for what it was. Renee, he said, using her name rather than a more general address. A small shift she noticed immediately. Whatever this is, you do not have to carry it alone simply because you are used to carrying things alone. Renee felt something in her chest tighten at that, closer to the truth than she was prepared to sit with. I appreciate that, she said carefully. But I have managed difficult things before. I can manage this too. Gideon studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to force a confession she was not ready to give. I am not asking you to prove anything to me, he said. I am telling you the offer stands. Whenever you decide you need it, no explanation required if you would rather not give one. Renee thanked him and returned to her work, telling herself she would find a solution before it came to that. A familiar promise she had been making herself for weeks without any evidence it was actually true. She thought, walking back toward the house, about how easy it would have been to simply tell him everything in that moment, and how much harder pride had somehow made a conversation that should have been simple, a pattern she recognized in herself but seemed unable, still, to break. She walked the rest of the way back to the staff quarters replaying the conversation in her mind, cataloging every point where she might have simply told him the truth and had not, and arrived at no better explanation than the one she had been giving herself for months, that admitting she needed help felt, even now, like admitting Patricia had won something, some small proof that Renee could not stand entirely on her own. It was an illogical fear, and she knew it was illogical even as she carried it. But knowing a fear is illogical has never yet been enough to make a person set it down. She resolved, as she had resolved a dozen times before, to handle the situation herself before it required anyone's rescue, a resolution that would last only as long as her remaining options did. Gideon watched her go without following, respecting the distance she had put back between them the moment the conversation ended, though he found himself, later that night, checking his phone twice for a message that had not come, aware, in a way he did not entirely examine, that he had begun caring what happened to her considerably more than a standard employer typically cared about a member of his household staff. Patricia's patience thinned considerably in the final week before the sale closed, and with it came a shift in tone Renee had not fully anticipated. Curtis appeared at the house unannounced 3 days before the deadline, informing Renee, with none of his mother's practiced coldness and considerably more open hostility, that the new owners intended to take possession the moment the sale closed, and that he had already arranged for a moving company to remove anything left behind, including, he implied without quite saying it outright, Renee herself. If she had not managed to leave on her own by then, Renee held her composure through the conversation, the same composure she had maintained through 13 months of grief and hostility, though it cost her considerably more than usual this time. She spent that night calling every option she had left: a friend's overcrowded apartment, a distant cousin who did not return her call, a shelter waitlist with no immediate openings, and came away from each conversation with the same answer: nothing available before the deadline arrived. She did not tell Gideon about Curtis's visit, though Marjorie, arriving early the next morning to find Renee already awake and hollow-eyed in the kitchen, finally pushed past the boundary she had respected for weeks. "Something has to give," Marjorie said gently, sitting down across from her. "You cannot keep carrying this alone, whatever it is." Renee, exhausted past the point of maintaining her usual careful walls, finally told her the truth in halting pieces: the sale, the deadline, Curtis's threat, the calls that had led nowhere. Marjorie listened without interrupting, then said only that Gideon needed to know today, not eventually, and that she would tell him herself if Renee could not bring herself to. Renee, too tired to argue, did not stop her. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long while after Marjorie left to find him, turning her cooling coffee cup slowly between her hands, oscillating between relief that the truth was finally out and a familiar, hollow embarrassment that it had taken someone else forcing the issue for her to say it at all. She thought about Curtis's visit again, the flat certainty in his voice when he described the movers, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had perhaps 4 days left before this stopped being a problem she could quietly manage and became one that would play out on Patricia's front lawn whether Renee was ready for it or not. When Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, his expression unreadable but his attention entirely fixed on her, Renee found, for the first time in 13 months, that she did not have the energy left to deflect him. Gideon's reaction, once Marjorie relayed what she knew, was immediate and considerably calmer than Renee expected, a man absorbing bad news the same way he absorbed everything difficult, without visible alarm, but with an urgency that showed itself in how quickly he began making calls. He reached out to his own attorney within the hour, exploring options to delay the sale or negotiate directly with the new buyers, though every option carried a timeline too slow to help Renee before the deadline actually arrived. The deadline itself landed on a Thursday evening, Curtis and 2 men from the moving company arriving at the house, while Renee was still packing the last of her belongings, Patricia watching from the doorway with the same unmoved expression she had worn through 13 months of Renee's grief. "You need to be off the property tonight," Curtis said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there during his earlier visit, the movers already loading a stack of boxes she had not finished sorting. Renee, standing on the front steps in the cold with 2 garbage bags and nowhere confirmed to go, felt the full weight of the night finally catch up to 13 months of careful composure, and reached, at last, for the phone number she had carried for 10 months without ever needing to prove she trusted it. "Locked out. No family." She sent the message and sat down on the cold concrete step, watching the porch light behind her switch off, uncertain whether she had just done the smartest thing she had done all year or the most humiliating, and too exhausted to fully care which it turned out to be. Curtis stood over the growing stack of boxes, directing the movers with an impatience that had curdled into something closer to cruelty, and Patricia, watching from the doorway, made no move to soften any part of what was happening, her silence its own kind of statement about exactly how little of her son's marriage she intended to preserve. Renee kept her eyes on her phone screen, willing the 3 small dots of a reply to appear, counting the seconds the way she had once counted contractions in nursing school, a strange, useless comparison that surfaced anyway in a mind too overwhelmed to filter its own thoughts. When her phone finally buzzed in her hand, a single line appeared, 5 words that did more to steady her than anything Patricia or Curtis had said all night. "On my way. Stay put." Renee read it twice, then a third time, something in her chest loosening for the first time in hours, and did the only thing left to do. She stayed exactly where she was, watching the street for headlights, and waited. Gideon arrived at the house 11 minutes after Renee's text landed, considerably faster than the distance between the estate and Patricia's neighborhood should have reasonably allowed, and stepped out of the car with a calm that made Curtis's aggressive posture toward the moving crew falter almost immediately. Renee watched him take in the scene, the garbage bags, the moving truck, Curtis, Patricia in the doorway, and felt something in her chest loosen at the simple fact that she was no longer facing this alone. "This is a private family matter," Curtis said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It concerns my employee," Gideon said evenly, "and I intend to make sure it is handled properly before anyone removes anything further tonight." He turned to Patricia directly. "I spoke with my attorney an hour ago. The sale closes tomorrow morning, not tonight, and until it does, Renee has every legal right to remain on this property without being forced out by a private moving crew with no court order authorizing it." Patricia's composure cracked slightly at that, clearly unprepared for a legal correction, delivered this calmly. Curtis, less composed than his mother, started to argue, and Gideon cut him off without raising his voice, the same quiet authority Renee had watched him use in the estate's kitchen months earlier. "You have one option that does not involve my attorney filing an emergency order tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "Your movers leave tonight, and Renee has until the sale legally closes to arrange her own departure on her own terms, with dignity, rather than being thrown out onto a curb by two men with a truck." Curtis, weighing the threat of legal trouble against a deadline that could simply wait one more day, backed down, calling off the movers with visible reluctance. Renee stood on the steps, watching the confrontation resolve without a single raised hand, and understood, watching Gideon calmly fold his phone back into his pocket, exactly why he had told her, 10 months ago, that using his number was never something to feel foolish about. Patricia, retreating into the doorway with what remained of her composure, made one final attempt to reassert some authority over the situation. "This is still a family matter," she said, though the words carried none of the certainty they had held an hour earlier. Gideon turned to her, his tone still even, still entirely without anger. "Renee has not been part of your family in any way that matters for 13 months, he said, "and the way she has been treated tonight is the last time that particular arrangement will be a problem either of us has to think about." He did not wait for a response, turning instead to Renee, his expression softening into something considerably gentler than the one he had shown Curtis and Patricia moments earlier. "Let us get you somewhere warm," he said simply, reaching for the two garbage bags at her feet before she could protest that she was capable of carrying them herself. Renee spent that final night in a spare room at the Marsh estate. The first night in 13 months she had slept without half her attention braced for the next confrontation, and moved the remainder of her belongings into a small apartment Gideon's attorney helped her secure the following week, close enough to the estate to keep her position without the impossible commute her previous options would have required. Patricia did not contact her again after the sale closed, the family conflict finally settling into the kind of permanent, quiet distance Renee found she could live with considerably more easily than she had expected to. Marjorie fussed over her for the first few days the way she fussed over everyone she considered hers to look after, leaving extra plates and checking in more often than strictly necessary, a kindness Renee no longer felt the need to deflect. Her relationship with Gideon shifted gradually in the weeks that followed, from careful employer and employee into something built on the kind of trust that had actually been tested rather than simply assumed, tested by exactly the kind of crisis that revealed whether someone's offer of help had been genuine or merely polite. 3 months after the night she had sat on a cold curb with two garbage bags, Renee found herself needing him again, though this time for something considerably smaller, a flat tire on a rainy evening, and reached for her phone without a single moment of the old hesitation, texting the same number without rehearsing the words first. "Flat tire, need a ride." He arrived 20 minutes later, unbothered by the ordinariness of the request, and Renee, climbing into the passenger seat out of the rain, understood how far she had come from a woman who had once needed 10 months and a locked door to finally believe she was allowed to ask for help at all. That evening, once the rain had passed and her car sat safely in the estate's garage with a new tire, Gideon found her again in the same kitchen where their first real conversation had happened, and asked, half serious, whether she planned on saving every future emergency, however small, for that same number. Renee considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "I think I plan on using it exactly as often as I need to," she said finally, and not one time less out of pride. Gideon smiled at that, an easy, unguarded expression she had rarely seen from him in her early months at the estate. "Good," he said, That is precisely what it was always for. Renee looked at him for a moment, at the quiet steadiness that had carried her through the worst night of the past 13 months, and thought, not for the first time recently, that she was no longer entirely certain she wanted this particular arrangement to stay confined to employer and employee.